You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Greetings, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It's my pleasure to have Ben Fleming back again. Welcome, Ben.
Nice to be here.
Great. Okay, we're connected. So this is actually take two here. And we are experimenting with my 2 free hours of local recording only to see if that improves some of the audio quality and overcomes some of the issues that I've been having as of late with dropouts and some other stuff. So anyways, I'm having Ben back on to finish a discussion that we started. My wife interrupted our last one. She was in need of my help. And these things, she assumes that after an hour and a half of podcasting, you should be done. And so it's okay to safe to start texting you over and over and over again about certain things. And so at a certain point in time, you have to stop and just say, deal with it.
I have very few episodes of my podcast which are less than 2 hours, and I really do try to keep them under an hour.
Yeah, I'm between an hour and a half. And just because most people listening to something that's 2-3 hours is a major commitment. And so it's one of those things where you want to not test the good graces of your listeners that way. But sometimes, a 3-hour podcast is what it takes to cover the material, and they're really worth the listen. And I know there's days when I'm out and about in my truck, especially, where just putting a 3-hour podcast on makes for great listening throughout the day while you're out and about. So,
we're having this conversation because I'm in the middle of an art history series on my podcast. Most of the episodes are north of 3 hours. So,
yeah, I think the whole thing you said is 30 hours now altogether.
30 hours, yep, and counting.
Which is the only challenge I have with it is I've been digesting it, but I have to do it at my desk because typically where I listen to podcasts is when I'm on the go in my truck. And then I don't have the visual aspect, and your series on art is a very visual podcast. So it really helps to have the pictures that you're putting up. So I've been working through it slowly when I'm doing things at my desk that don't require me to, where I'm not worried about what I'm listening, changing what I'm writing and stuff. So that sort of thing, when I'm doing research and some other things and just like data crunching and things, I can generally get away with having something on in the background. And then you can have it up on the video screen and see the pictures as it goes. But anyways, we're here to finish off our discussion on art. And it had sort of two titles, what is art and what happened to it? And last episode, we really got through, I think, the bulk of sort of what is art. And now we're going to discuss sort of what happened to it. And I think your demarcation point for kind of where art, this thing that sort of began in the 1700s and 1800s, where it went sideways and why. So why don't you start us off, Ben, sort of with the turn of the 20th century?
Sure. Well, I'm just going to correct one thing there. I'm not sure I would say it went sideways so much as it just went in so many different directions that it ceased to be a really coherent concept. And they weren't all necessarily negative directions. So just to recap, up until the time of the Impressionists, whatever art was, it was just done by the academies. Paint and marble was too expensive for anybody to do a painting or a sculpture unless they were an academician. But in the late 19th century, due to industrialization, you started having people with a little bit of hustle who, if they had talent, they were able to start selling their goods outside of the official academy system. And, in some ways you had things that I would say are positive. You had things like the arts and crafts movement in England, which focused on not just making the entire room or the entire building, but focused on doing things like handicraft, trying to avoid mass production wherever possible. But you also certainly had a number of other streams, like the Russian constructivists, where they said, we're just going to do away with the old stuff altogether, and it's a new century. It's the 20th century. We're going to start building with a bunch of industrial scraps because we're going to make these constructions instead of sculpture. It's a new century, time for a new concept of art. And I'm not going to say the whole thing was good or the whole thing was bad. I'm just saying that by the time we reach the early 20th century, especially by the time we reach the 1920s, it's not even a coherent concept anymore. And you do have people in high culture who really do try to rescue this concept, to try to make sure there is some definition of the word that rich people can spend money on to pretend that they're cultured. But, by the time we get to the mid 20th century, you've got Jackson Pollock dripping paint on a canvas. You've got Andy Warhol painting soup cans. You've got all these really minimalistic sculptures, which are just cubes and rectangles. Is the concept even meaningful to talk about anymore at this point? So I'd say that was my demarcation point, the early 20th century. Not because it went sideways, just because without an institution like the Royal Academy or the Académie des Beaux-Arts having a monopoly on it, it moved in so many different directions that doesn't mean anything anymore. I don't know.
That's an interesting way to think. It's a way I've never really thought about it, because one of the things we talked about in the last episode was, with the rise of industrialization, one of the changes that comes about is that art supplies become very inexpensive.
Yep.
And so you don't need to attach yourself to a master painter or as you say, the academies or some larger studio that has patronage from, the king or the duke or some institution, whatever. But you can just go out and buy supplies and you can go paint. Like you can do, plein air painting, you can consider yourself educated, and you can just go and, take up the practice of painting. And a lot of men did that, women too. Right. And so it, in some ways it seems almost like, that there's what would be the way to put it? It seems to be related almost to the sense of kind of like that Nick Land concept that he applies to economics, where art achieves a kind of escape velocity, where it escapes its confines and of the confines of the academy for those that would say, well, this is what it is and this is what it isn't, and do so by controlling just production and what is being produced. And once you're outside of that, then it achieves escape velocity. So anybody who, art can be whatever it wants to be then, like the what is it, Ratatouille, right? Anyone can cook, it's sort of like anyone can do art. And that idea probably takes a little while to take hold, but now like every kindergartner in public school is an artist, right? And you're trying to unlock their creativity.
Well, absolutely. Like art, we talked about this a lot last time. Art was always a tenuously defined concept in the first place, but it really didn't matter if there was only one major academy in your country, and they could say what we make is art and what we don't make is not art, and it's as simple as that. But when it starts to reach escape velocity, as you say, it is hard to. It's hard to pin down, if you can pin it down at all. Maybe it was just revealing that it was never a coherent concept in the first place. I don't know. And also on the subject of anybody can make it. Yeah, absolutely. In the 20th century, it doesn't matter where you live. There's probably a local community college that teaches painting classes, and you can go take a class or two. And maybe some people are very talented and they can make really talented landscapes or portraits or whatever. but they're never going to get written about in a prestige magazine. They're never going to get a write up in Newsweek or Time magazine like somebody like Andy Warhol would in the mid 20th century, where they say this guy is the trendsetter in this thing called art. Probably every city in America and in Canada and in Europe has talented painters in it now because paint supplies are so cheap. But who is going to get past this gatekeeper? In fact, what even is the gatekeeper? What is the filter in the first place that determines what gets written about in the cultural pages of the prestige institutions?
Well, there is still some level of academy, right? Like, okay, take for example in the area where we are, right? In Canada, in the province of Ontario, there, like, you can go to community college and you can learn how to paint and they'll teach you. But if you want to take a stab at making it in the art scene, then, and you're not, you weren't, your parents don't own a gallery and you're not wealthy and move in the gallery scene to begin with, the way to go is to come up through Ontario College of Art and Design. Right. And so then that, at least when I was at Ontario College of Art, it plugs you into the haute couture of the Canadian art scene in that regard. And so you get invited to all the right parties, you meet all the right people, and it was basically that, sort of on your talent. And if somebody kind of takes you under their wing, and however I crashed out. It was just too big an experience for me as a young Christian from a sheltered environment to move to that. I was not ready for the experience and I crashed out. But I got enough of a taste of it to understand, in a sense of, like, had I come at it now in my late 50s, I would be a little bit more disciplined about the approach. I probably could still resurrect my skills and go back. But I mean, it's, your window passes and such is life, right? Yep. So it's, but it is a thing where there are some of these types of mechanisms. I think maybe the other aspect, and one of the things that always struck me in art school, is one of the things that always fascinated professors was your ability to do things conceptually. So were you willing to push the boundaries conceptually? And I think this is, in a sense, the same thing that made me good at philosophy and theology, was that I was a better conceptualist than my skills were at painting, which, I mean, I can do that at a fairly high level. But that was one of the things I think that, in the Greeks, through the Middle Ages, that it was more the excellence and the skill with which you brought, marble to life and so forth, right? But whereas today, because anybody can paint, what is it that really separates, what is it really that today that makes art? And it would lean on the concept, right? And that's maybe where things begin to sort of spin out everywhere, is because now you can add all these different concepts to sort of explain what's going on in the canvas. And so the person like Andy Warhol, who can conceptually sell what he's doing, the concept of it, then if people buy into the concept, the actual paintings maybe don't even matter that much anymore. And that sort of gets you down to like data in that sense of, like, why did putting a toilet in a gallery or a urinal in a gallery, why is that art, right? That was, I think, the question that you began this whole thing with.
Well, or, I mean, let's take it one step farther than that. I mean, when you say that it really doesn't matter what actually gets painted, it's just the ideas. Maybe that means we just need to retire this word art completely and just go back to what they did 300 years ago and just said it's painting or it's sculpture or it's handicraft or it's engraving or it's poetry or whatever else it is. Why do we need this extra layer of abstraction on top of it? I mean, you talked about how it's like data. I mean, you can't, I'm a software engineer in my Clark Kent life. You can't manage data without layers of abstraction on top of things. So maybe the exact same thing happened.
Yeah. It is an interesting thing to look at, this sense of because you're right, it's sort of to ask yourself, like what is art? It's that same thing with that American judge when they were on the Supreme Court, when they, or was it maybe, I don't know, but it was one of these American judges when they were talking about pornography, right? Like, try to get me, like, I know it when I see it, right? And so there is still something about this. And I think there is an aspiration with art to separate itself from mere craft. So there's a sense like anybody can do, anybody can just do arts and crafts, right? That's kind of the that, and I know that's not the case, but that's kind of the pretense that's put it. Anyone can do arts and craft, but we're doing arts, and it's something serious and elevated, and it's important, and we're challenging this, and we're breaking down that, and we're doing something significant here. We're not just making furniture or something boring, or if we're making furniture, we're making groundbreaking furniture, these types of things. So there is a sense, I think, where art is essentially status.
Okay. So that actually is a pretty good segue to something that happens around the turn of the century. So yeah, I'll jump into the history lesson here. So as I said, the Impressionists, they were the 1870s, 1880s, doing things outside of the academic system. The 1890s, or like I said, I guess late 1880s, early 1890s, that's when you get people like Van Gogh and Gauguin, who they don't become famous till decades after, but such is the life of a creative. But in 1897, you have something big that happens in Vienna. That's when you have a group of academicians who all decide to leave the academy at once and create their new art compound. They call it the Vienna Secession. And they are going to say, our organization, we are actually going to be the true stewards of art going forward. The academies have gotten old and stale, but we are the ones who are truly going to be the flag bearers going forward. Now, I'm sure stuff like this happened time and time again throughout history, but for whatever reason, in Habsburg, Austria, Hungary, within the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were able to sell themselves well enough to get a bunch of government commissions to build buildings that were done in a very different style than they were done before. Now, they're not brutalism or anything like that you associate with the 20th century, but the buildings, they're much less ornate. There's much less ornamentation and decoration on them. They use new materials like tile on the outside. And when this happens across Europe, a lot of creatives, they start getting ideas in their head. They said, wait a second, this group of creatives were able to break free of the academic system and actually make something of themselves. Remember, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, like Gauguin, they don't get famous till decades afterwards. The Vienna Secession, they were famous in their own day. And this is where you start getting the model of almost what you were describing about, Ontario's haute couture scene. This is when you start getting these art compounds that have, usually in the form of a manifesto, not always, but they have some sort of a philosophical vision of art. And it's not just a case of you can be a freelancer with a bit of hustle and try to find buyers for yourself. There just aren't enough art collectors in the world, let alone modern art collectors. There's maybe a couple hundred in the entire world who are willing to buy stuff that are made in the last 5 years. But if you don't want to be part of the academy, or you can't make it into the academy, you now can see if you can join one of these compounds that has a leader with a philosophical vision. I don't want to say it's a cult, but some of them are basically cults. And does it mean that you are viewing things in a different way, or does it just mean that, okay, instead of going along with the rules of the formal academy. I'm going to go along with the rules of the Vienna Secession or the Futurists or the Cubists or the German Expressionists or whoever else. So this is, I think this is probably the right place to pick up if we're talking about at the turn of the century. You know, you get a lot of these small groups of creatives. I don't want to overplay how important they were, because again, they were always small groups of about a dozen people, and they maybe had a few new money patrons. That's it. But this is where you start getting, you know, the Art Manifesto saying that, yeah, everything up until this point is garbage, but now we see the right way to do things going forward. This is very much a phenomenon between, again, as 1897 when the Vienna Secession starts and about 1930.
Well, it's interesting because the way you're describing that there is very different than, say, where, you know, say at the peak of the masters, right? The Dutch masters. Because there you have Amsterdam, there all this money slushing around, and you have all of these guys who are growing quite wealthy, and they're looking for ways to express their wealth. And so, you know, like the Night Watchmen, these are groups of men who want Rembrandt to paint them. And so you see it when you go and see at the Rijksmuseum, and you see sort of the paintings of the era, you get a lot of people, you know, it's portraiture, but you have this society, that society. They want their portrait to be painted by these masters, and the masters add touches that make them, you know, there's commentary in the picture, in the paintings. There's little subtle things that you don't necessarily pick up, but you can do work on. Like, they're very complex and rich, but they're ultimately being done for a client as a kind of way to express status and wealth. In that regard, they're being patrons. Whereas it seems that when you have this Vienna Secession, that there's a shift in a sense of, like, they weren't then like revolutionary themselves, but there is this sense that you're no longer just doing patronage from wealthy patrons, in a sense, and you're catering to their needs. You're in a sense flipping it and saying these ideas are important, and you're now selling these ideas to these wealthy folks. And many of these ideas that you're selling are ideas that, at least in their minds, I think, challenge some of this old order. Like, as you say, everything is new now. And so you're getting the very people that are buying the paintings to join in these kind of very new revolutionary ideas, which is there is a shift in art that does occur that way. And I think it's not insignificant, and it does then change the dynamic of what's happening with art and painting.
Well, yes and no. That shift happened about half a century earlier with people like Gustave Courbet, and even with the Impressionists. They were definitely trying to target nouveau riche people, saying that, if you can't afford a big aristocratic painting, don't worry, you can still be cultured and you can go along with us. And even from Courbet onwards, this was the 1840s, it was always looking for this self-loathing new money who wanted to prove that they weren't just about the almighty dollars. So I don't think that was necessarily new in the 1890s. But what was new was the way that these, painting compounds or these artistic compounds were structured. That, instead of looking for an individual artist who was working outside the system but maybe had a bit of hustle, now, as you said, you need to prove that you're on board with this independent, let's call it an artistic cult. You need to prove that you're on board with their ideas to be a good bourgeois, to be a good bougie person.
Yeah.
So
from there, from the Vienna Secession, where does this then go then? How does this sort of play out as it begins to sort of spread within sort of art and society?
So you have half a dozen cities across Europe that start developing their own avant-gardes. I mean, most famously the Cubists in Paris, but not just them. You have the Futurists in Milan. You have two iterations of German Expressionism. You have the Bridge in Dresden, and you have the Blue Rider with Kandinsky in Munich. You have the Suprematists in Moscow, which is really just one guy who paints a black square. But the 1910s is when you really start getting this almost radical, completely new deconstructive view of art, where it's not just good enough to start doing things in a different way. Now we have to almost completely break the rules, and they always write their manifestos. They always go the same way. Sure, the Renaissance artists were great, but in their day, they were pioneers discovering something new. I mean, I can't be a Renaissance artist. I wouldn't be doing anything new there. I need to do something completely different. And, sometimes it led to something at least interesting. I would say that the people like Kirchner, the Bridge group in Dresden, I'd say they did some interesting stuff. Sometimes it's people like Malevich who literally paint a black square and then write an essay on why reducing art to, as he called it, the 0th degree, the zero form, complete geometric shapes is truly the way to an undocumented continent in art. You wonder how much of this is just a bit of sophistry. But this is the time period from about 1910 until World War I breaks out. Now, as the traditional art history narrative goes, if you go do an art history degree, you're learning about all the weird stuff in the 20s that we now call modernism, because that's what you need to be able to, I'm not going to mince words, bloviate about if you want to be the curator of a prestige museum. But it actually really comes from before World War I. After World War I, for various reasons, probably the biggest one of which just being people want to put the war behind them, a lot of this old art when I say old, I mean from about the 1890s until World War I breaks out. So when I say old, I mean going as far back as Van Gogh. That stuff starts to become popular after World War I, and a lot of people associate these new aesthetics with, okay, we want to put World War I behind us. But it's actually these weird revolutionary ideas, or these weird ideas about we need to do something completely different with art. That is the period immediately preceding World War I. And that's the completely new way that the art world outside the academies is structured. It's structured as these small compounds, which I don't want to overstate how important they were. It was maybe 6 or 7 cities across Europe had a small avant-garde with a couple dozen people in it.
And that in a sense too, it underlies the sort of the conceptual nature, because this is, I think, where Dimes and Gio and I were talking, where you can say like art as revealing something in society, in a sense, where you're trying to expose an aspect of modernity, and you're trying to use the art as a vehicle for people to see sort of the being and the essence of their day, in a sense, where, in this regard, in a sense, is there a value in brutalism, in that regard, right? So, and that was one of the examples that we gave. And so it is this sense where this idea of the concept of novelty, and it's almost as if everything, like you said, it's breaking out of contain. But in this regard, is the painting itself? That's the sort of the question, really. I mean, I know people are still painting and we're still talking about art, but are people buying more something that is fashionable, something that is, like the new idea, the new thing, or are they buying, and this, I guess, is the question, is there like intrinsic value in the art itself without the concept, the novelty, and the fashion that goes along with it?
So my answer to that would be that the idea of nouveau riche people looking to buy the idea, that's true in Paris in the aftermath of World War I. That's true in Paris in 1921. I don't think that's necessarily true anywhere else. Paris has been the center of the arts in Europe really since Louis XIV built Versailles. And it's not until after World War II that it moves over to New York. You've got a very unique culture in Paris where you have this bourgeois middle class who wants to almost be involved in this conversation, this back, and they want to buy avant-garde art, or at least if they're not going to buy it themselves, they at least want to be part of the cultural milieu where these conversations are happening. They want to be able to say they met Ernest Hemingway and Marcel Duchamp at a cafe on the left bank of Paris in 1920. I don't think it's really universal beyond that. I guess that brings me to my next point, is that now that the art world has been completely institutionalized by the 20th century university system, I think a lot of it is just LARPing at 1920s Paris. I think a lot of it is trying to build a simulacrum of this conversation, of this milieu, of this environment that existed at a very specific time and place, where people were not just asking, but what truly is art, where people wanted to incorporate the latest intellectual ideas, whether it was an idea from physics or an idea from Sigmund Freud. In fact, why is it that even now to this day, people want to sound intelligent by talking about one of Sigmund Freud's theories when, Freud's theories have mostly been just proven to be stuff he made up off the top of his head. Came up with the idea of a subconscious. I'm not sure if he was right about anything else beyond that. It's because we're trying to, by way of the university system, keep a simulacrum of the left bank in Paris in 1920 alive. I don't want to say it's that cut and dry, but the more I read about this stuff, the more I realize that all of these conversations that we have about what truly is art anyways, that was probably, somebody wrote an essay about that in Paris in the 20s.
Well, and you've made that, this is like a previous conversation we had, like, why are we stuck in the 1920s? Mm-hmm. And that was the title of it. But it is interesting when you talk about, because as you were talking, I was thinking about, trying to capture 1920s Paris. But you think about, like, if you go into someone's home, and even if it's like, it's minimalist or whatever, but a lot of times the types of homes, you see them in the architecture magazines and so forth, there is a whole genre of wealthy person, stylish person, and you go into their home and it does have that feel of a 1920s salon, where all the walls are covered in art and the furniture's a certain way. And it just has this sort of perfectly cluttered feel without being overly cluttered. And it's almost like it's a museum piece that you're trying to recreate in your home with the paintings that you can acquire, with your income. But to me, it seems like there is really something to that, that sense of the cultured person, and what does he look like? What does his library look like, and these sorts of things. And I think that's I think that's a good way to look at it, where everything is kind of frozen there, and a lot of the things that we're doing are just recycling the things that they were doing then.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to have this conversation about what truly is art anyways, at a time when, again, I believe that art has, again, it's not that it's meaningless, it's that it's gone in so many different directions that it's not coherent anymore. If you want to keep having this philosophical conversation about what truly is art, why not rewind the clock to a time when that was a pressing conversation?
Well, in this regard, is that I wonder, and maybe this is the problem that we have today, is that the conversation has kind of been had. You emerge from World War II, and that whole world is shattered. And then you move into the world of hypercapitalism.
Yeah.
And so, and so then I guess, that's a question. Is like everything dead after World War II? It's
after World War II. It's much has been written about the CIA. I think a lot of it is exaggerated, but when the United States and Russia divided up, when four countries divided up Berlin, but the United States and the USSR were the two most important ones, it almost turned into a propaganda battle for the hearts and minds of people in Berlin. And a lot of the things that we think of as art from the mid-century were just weapons in this ideological battle for one city. Famously, people say that Jackson Pollock was a CIA asset, and technically speaking, he was, but it's really just, the Americans and the Russians are trying to have an argument in Berlin over who's more culturally sophisticated. And the Russians are saying, we do things in the traditional way. And the Americans are saying, we've broken so many rules, come to New York and you can do anything you want. So you want to talk hypercapitalism. It's also much more of a constructed story in the age of mass communication.
Well, it's interesting though too that if you can frame it like if you look at sort of today now, looking back on this period, during that time it was basically America the free, free capitalism, free market, fighting against communism and government control and totalitarianism. And that was sort of the way it played out on the surface. But then as you dive into it, you begin to realize like, oh, the Americans pretty much built industrial Russia. FDR funneled all kinds of resources into Russia to basically get their industry started and kept it going. And then like, oh, there was this really generally old European conservative type thing in Rhodesia. And basically the Americans, Europeans funded the communist overtaking of white Rhodesia, and so and you begin to sort of look at all of these different kind of ops, and then you think of all of the layers of government funding in art, and maybe the whole thing really is in a large part tied into ideological projects on various sides. So that art is now almost entirely a left progressive activity.
So propaganda is most effective when you're actually telling the truth, and
which is a funny thing. You're absolutely right. That is true.
So the biggest propaganda weapon in the global American empire's quiver is the fact that they make sure every history book starts in 1945. You can make your books completely true and completely factual as long as they start in 1945. If you really want to see the full story, you need to get a smooth transition that goes from about 1930 to 1960, which is actually something I'm really trying to do with my current series, because the 1930s was sometimes called the pink decade or the red decade, because everybody who was anybody in the American upper class was communist. It's the point, like a lot of 1930s literature was rich people trying to make representation of the working class in the way that now they try to put ethnic minorities into everything. The 1930s gets completely airbrushed out of a lot of narratives beyond just saying, yeah, we were having an economic downturn, and we needed to implement the New Deal to make sure that the boom and bust cycle wasn't as extreme. No, there is a much more detailed story about American arts and letters in the 30s. And I think one of the biggest ways to melt that propaganda down is to just come up with a coherent narrative that starts in 1930, goes all the way through the war to what happened in the 1950s and 1960s. Because the people who were communists in the 30s, a lot of them changed their mind when they were completely blindsided by Hitler and Stalin announcing they had a pact together. But a lot of them ended up entering the bureaucracy, and that didn't start to reveal itself till the 50s and 60s. So if you want to talk about how much of it is a propaganda war or how much of it is a left liberal activity, the way you get to the bottom of that is just don't start the story in 1945.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that, if some of the current debates and argumentation are, relitigating all of those narratives. And that's, in a sense, the process of what is happening like right now in the discourse is this relitigation of things. Now, it also raises the question that if this thing that we call art is really part of left progressive, upper middle class to rich, status signaling, it's all part of the, being in the right parties, the right scene, having the right money, getting the right collection and being seen as being cultured and artistic and buying the right stuff. That this fashion element, this element of this is the thing that the cool people do, and this is the thing that that the elites do in this regard. It's always seemed as kind of I guess to me, it renders the whole idea of what you might call right-wing art as a suspect project, because the right is inherently downscale. And so anything that the right does is kind of looked upon as like kitsch. This is just, it's like arts and crafts. You sell it at the county fair, but nobody takes it seriously. You're just out there painting and like, yeah, go do that and whatever. But, we're going to continue to do art in the main centers of leftist power, prestige, and money.
So I may be a minority here. I don't believe in the concept of kitsch. That's something that was made up by Clement Greenberg.
Well, I realize me too as well. But yes, it's that's the way it's framed, right? Is yeah.
So yes and no. Probably the most recent major right winger in art was Salvador Dali, or at least he wasn't a complete left winger. I mean, he hung out with a bunch of communists because the surrealists were Trotskyists, but he had some friction with them because he just didn't really care about Hitler. He wasn't going to go around condemning Hitler every 5 minutes. He just cared about making his art. I mean, he wanted to get into Sigmund Freud's good graces before Sigmund Freud died. And so how do they deal with somebody like Salvador Dali? Very simple. I keep talking about how there's this official art history narrative, which, I think the more you dive into it, it's not really true at all. But when somebody wants to make it in the contemporary art world, they have to come up with a theory about how I was affected by this person, who was affected by that person, who was affected by Jasper Johns, who was affected by Marcel Duchamp, who was affected by such and such, all the way back. Sure, they let Salvador Dali keep doing his stuff until he died. I think he died in 1989, relatively recently. But, nobody says I was affected by Salvador Dali. They just let him do his thing until he died off. And they just never let any new and upcoming artists become the heir apparent to Salvador Dali's. So, I mean, I don't completely agree that there's no such thing as right-wing art. I just think that the political environment that, the water we all swim in encompasses everything, including the arts.
Yeah. So, and I guess that comes back to the question then of, like what is art then, right? And so if you are a conservative, a Christian, a right winger, and you're painting, sculpting, and the question is like, in a sense, like, what are you doing then? And that would be, and this is like, are you applying like right wing concepts to what you're doing? Does that make it propaganda then? Are you like doing counter propaganda? Or is there something organic, that are you offering a meaning? Are you doing the work of revealing the essence of today's world to today's world, in a sense, like the way that, like you're doing critical work in that regard in your art? Or is it, are you just helping understand, that this is a vehicle for understanding, that type of thing? It is, for me, this whole question of right-wing art, and I think has always, I've tried to wrap my head around it and just have never been able to come up with sort of a satisfactory kind of, I mean, are you doing just art that then resonates with right-wing people? Can there be something like pure art without a concept? It comes to the whole thing, a concept, and then is it really art unless it's taken up into the scene of what is fashionable? I mean, yes, like you say, Salvador Dali made art, people bought it, and but like you say, nobody refers to him as their muse because his politics are bad. Mm-hmm. These type of things. So I guess those are like some of the questions that I kind of tool around with, because this is one of these discussions that happens is, well, we need to have right-wing art. And then there's the question, well, what is it? And what is art? And I'm not sure that most people have even the people that are trying to do it have a really good answer for it. Like I know somebody like Fen de Villiers, where he's doing his vitalist pieces, seems to me it's always been like it looks, when I see his work, which I enjoy it, as an extension of Art Deco. Again, we're going back to the 1920s again.
Yeah, you said about three things there that I want to address.
Or more, probably.
Yeah. So
yeah, go ahead.
First of all, I don't think there was ever a time that it wasn't propaganda, even if it was, turn of the century, you were in one of these art compounds with about 6 people in them. You still had to prove you were on board with whatever the manifesto or the prevailing philosophy of your compound's leader was. But also, after World War I, that was when Europe was safe for democracy. And what do you get when Europe is safe for democracy? You get the ideological or totalitarian dictator who is doing everything in the name of an ideology that has to be in the name of the people, because that way you're technically not a king. And who is going to help you overthrow the system and become the dictator? You need propagandists, and those propagandists were a lot of these avant-garde artists from before World War I. So, I mean, look, the futurists, they were propagandists for Mussolini, though they helped Mussolini on his rise to power. Once Mussolini got into power, he didn't want them anymore. He said, I'm going to be playing on Italian nationalism, and that means we're going to go back and do things in the old Renaissance way of doing things. So he didn't completely get rid of the futurists. He said, you guys are just going to be the eccentrics off to the side. I don't know if there was ever a time that what you call art wasn't propaganda, not least because the term art is something that's always been tenuously defined, and whatever definition it had was always coupled heavily to a political movement or to an institution.
Well, even like if you go back to like the Dutch masters, those are also forms of propaganda. Like it's, you're presenting the wealth and power of that upper level of the merchant classes in the Netherlands, right? And so those paintings are a propaganda effort on their parts. We want you to display us in a certain way. Well, that's a form of propaganda.
So I'm going to address another one of the points you made, though.
Sure.
Saying just how do you do right-wing art today? What would it even mean? Another thing you really have to understand is that we live in a completely different society that for the first time has a new business model of art. From, as I said, the time of Gustave Courbet up until really about 15 years ago, if you wanted to make it as an artist who was outside of an institution, you basically had to live near the potential buyers, the bourgeois people, whether it was in Paris, whether it was in New York, wherever it was. You had Gauguin, who went to the ends of the earth, went to Tahiti for a little bit and died, in disease and poverty. But the rest of them, for as much as they love to rip on the bourgeoisie and talk about how terrible bourgeois culture is, they lived in the same neighborhoods as the bourgeoisie, and these are the people they were selling to. So this is the way it was in my adult life. Even still, you had your insufferable art school students who talked about how much they hated middle class stifling lifestyle, but they still asked
sold art to them.
Well, they still sold art to them, and they still asked their dad for an allowance every month. So it was
they were
still
raising consciousness.
Oh, exactly. And I'm saying it was the same kind of performativity up until at least the late 2000s, and probably even the early 2010s. Now, anybody who actually has enough talent to sell paintings, they go out, live in the sticks so they can afford to live, and they sell their stuff online if they have any talent. If they need to go to an art show or something, they can hop on a plane. It's not that expensive to do that anymore. So for the first time in 170 years, the business model of making paintings or of making sculptures or making other artistic products has completely changed. You don't need to either sell to bourgeois people or else do something really weird, say it's performance art, then go out to the Arts Council or the Cultural Council with your hand held out saying this is, an important piece of Canadian culture or American culture going forward. You don't need to do either one of those two things anymore. And as a result, I think whatever art is, if we even still use the term, I'm not convinced we even need to still have the term anymore. But whatever this thing is going to be completely different going forward because the business model was just broken. The business model of 170 years was just broken.
That's another interesting thought, Ben, that because you think about it too, like a lot like what we're doing here right now, high-speed internet makes conversations across time and space much easier, sort of, remote work and all of that. And now you can build communities like you mentioned earlier. You would be stuck in, if you were, say, in rural Canada, you would be the smart guy in town. You went away to school, you would come back, and then you would still be the smart guy. You'd be the one guy in town with a collection of books, and you would be the one that, everybody knew that you were the guy that knew everything because, well, he went away to Oxford and he studied, he went back to England. And now you're not just the only guy in town with a library connection. With an internet connection, you can connect yourself up to a whole group of guys who are all just like you and who their normal life would have been like, nobody cares about that book stuff that you do. We have real world things to deal with here. But now you can get connected with a critical mass of, bookworms like yourself. But then also it enables you to do, as you say, to sell if you're painting stuff and you can put it online and you can convince people to buy it. not only can you sell the paintings, but now you can do a YouTube show about the process of painting and have people do, and so you have you can begin to interact with it. It can become sort of a multi-platform type of thing where it's not just the painting, but it's the connection with the audience by sitting there talking to them on the camera while you're painting. People do this with furniture making all the time, right? And anybody can make furniture, but now you can do furniture making plus the video process of talking people through the creative process of making furniture, these types of things. So yeah, I think you're right that there is a change. And the question is whether, as you say, is art the right term for it? Like as you were talking earlier, is, and it's maybe a pejorative, and maybe I'm playing a series of devil's advocate in this regard, but is art just grift? That type of thing. And there are those who might say that it's always been that way.
Yeah, I'm gonna make 2 points here. The first one is that there's a second side of what you just said there. It's not just that the people out in the rural communities can now meet other people online and develop a critical mass. Also, the fact that there are these communities online and there's people putting out content like we do, like this. The value of the degree is collapsing as well. Why do you think you have so many people, especially above a certain age, who are starting to get perturbed that nobody takes them seriously anymore because I have an art history degree, or I studied English, or I studied history? Like, good on you, buddy. I can learn twice as much for free off of YouTube. And, some people are self-deprecating about that. There are some people, especially ones who got their job based on their degree, especially people who work for bureaucracies and the such, who got in under the wire. They really don't like the fact that the status of their degree seems to be disappearing because we live in a different world where the university is no longer the keeper of the sacred knowledge.
Well, I could see us going back to, though, more of like an academy type model, where people begin to say, hey, instead of us doing this all online, why don't we, make some capital investments and set up a real community? Yep. And then we could, because there is still some value. Like I know too, like the university system, say for music instruction, for example, which is another arts, like music instruction. I mean, you can do some of it online, but it's really a hands-on type of business. You can't, it's really hard to teach somebody the piano online, that regard, or teach somebody the guitar online. I mean, you can do it to even woodworking to some extent, you can learn it online, but there is a thing where you do have to, it's good to have somebody who has knowledge of the materials, and the instruments, all these different things firsthand. So I could see reorganization. And then, like you say, we get guys who are studying books. And, we, like Athenian Stranger and I, are doing a deep dive on Gadamer's Truth and Method, where you decide, like, hey, like I said, get some capital investment and you develop a school. We're going to, and we could, and you can combine sort of a mixture of on-site internet and so forth, that as long as these structures stay in place, where you can see new forms emerging, because right now the university system is broken, like seriously broken.
Is it broken, or is it not fit for purpose anymore? The mid-20th century is very much a historical aberration, because the intellectuals in society in the mid-20th century were all professors. That would not have been the case any other time in history. I think last time you mentioned positions like the poet laureate. For the most part throughout history, if you wanted to be an intellectual, it was, could you get your stuff published? That the rise of managerial capitalism in the mid 20th century necessitated a lot of people to be trained for certain jobs. And before all these jobs were digitized and computerized away, one of the best proxies for finding people who are good at a paper pushing job was, could they read Shakespeare for 4 years? That world doesn't exist. It hasn't existed for 50 years, probably even longer than that. But the mid 20th century was really the only time when, if you said I'm an intellectual, that was synonymous with I'm a professor. That just wouldn't have been the case at any other time in history. And I think we're just reverting to the mean.
Yeah, I think that the professorship thing, that really kind of probably goes back to, excuse me, the German system in that regard. It, I guess the question is where does this thing that we call art go from here? Like, I mean, we've been kind of hinting around. I mean, is it about your talent with the materials? Do you have the technical skills to do it well, or is it about the ideas, or is it about the marketing and the scene that you have a scene that there's a sense of fashion status to it? Or is it just merely that you can sell it and get somebody to buy it? Are we back to that question again, or that you can get somebody to sponsor you, in that regard? So and then you have like the competition with AI, sort of where does art go from here? Because I think you're right in a sense where things are kind of, I don't know, stuck is maybe the right word, but it almost seems like we're in a holding pattern waiting for something new to emerge.
Well, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how everything seems to be a simulacrum of 1920s Paris. You're asking, is art a grift or are people talented? Well, in 1920s Paris, you couldn't just be a bloviator who showed up in Paris's, upper middle class / rich avant-garde scene. You had to have the chops, but these were the people who were writing their essays and writing their manifestos about what truly is art anyway. And it like I said, it was a real milieu where these conversations were, meaningful. I mean, you go back and read some of these essays. You read Jean Cocteau's The Cock and the Harlequin. You read After Cubism by Le Corbusier. These essays, I think they're just as relevant to whatever art is now, but they were having this conversation in 1920s Paris where it was organic and there were a lot of people, there was a lot of creative energy all over the place where it really was a conversation, what truly is art. And, the problem is these people trained the next generation of artists to say, well, you don't need to have any rules anymore. You can just ask what really art is. And as every generation has gone on, people seem to have less and less technical talent, but they are just as good as ever at the sophistry of asking, but what truly is art? And yes, my banana duct tape to the wall truly is art. So that's the first thing. But the second thing I'm going to say is you asked, what does right-wing art really mean? Some of these essays that I'm talking about, they've survived to now. They're relevant because of survivorship bias. You can go back to essays written in this time and place in 1920s Paris, and you can find equally as, I don't know, let's say vibrant. You can find equally as engaging writing about people who completely disagree with this new modern aesthetic as well. And I'm not saying that I'm taking one side or the other. I'm saying you read both sides of it, and both sides seem like these are true intellectuals, truly intelligent people writing both sides of these. And I'm saying it almost doesn't matter now because these writings are a product of a specific time and place. We don't live in that time. We don't live in that place. Yes, we can LARP and repeat this discussion about what truly is art anyways. Is a urinal truly art? Is Dadaism, is surrealism truly the way of doing art in the future? I mean, it's yes, we can have these conversations now. I just don't think it's terribly meaningful or helpful to have these conversations when all you're doing is rehashing, the left bank of Paris in 1922.
Yeah, So then the question, I guess, then comes is it's like, okay, if the discourse is stuck and we're just rehashing the same conversation over and over again, is where do we go? Because I myself, I like to go around to like these small artist community, and we have a number of them in Ontario, and buy paintings that I like and hang them in my living room. It's and that's kind of the way where I don't spend obscene amounts of money on them, but it's they please me and that works, And I often find the artists engaging people who I enjoy talking with, and talking about. But the question, I guess, then comes out, if we're all stuck in the same basic debate that's been there for the 1920s, is where do we go from here then? Or do we just keep recycling the same debate over and over again? That seems to me in some sense to be somewhat pointless, maybe. Or do we just get back to the business of painting and sculpting and doing that and just forget about the debate? Maybe somehow it seems it's still that debate. It just seems somehow, and maybe it's just I'm analytical and I like to understand things, but maybe I just need to let go of that desire to understand what's going on and just do it.
Well, but again, the debate was never who bought this stuff. I mean, you were talking about the cottage industries last time. There were always people buying that stuff. The question is who writes about it in the prestige newspapers. So, if you want to get out of this cycle where art seems to be hideous and terrible, the easiest way to do that would just be take over the institutions of mass information and just have them say that the beautiful stuff is art. Don't let them call it kitsch or whatever. Yeah.
And that comes back to the question of, status and fashion, right? Because
it always was.
Left-wingism is high status and right-wing is considered low status, right? So you're really facing an uphill battle that way, because you're working against the dominant civilizational frame and narrative in that sort of creative, like the conservative, the right wing, the Christian or whatever, who's painting, sculpting, so forth, crafting, is doing so from a position that's outside of the place where somebody's writing about it in a magazine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think it's a complete lost cause. I will give you an example of a primary document from, again, 100 years ago. So do you know who Giorgio de Chirico was?
The name rings a bell.
So he, before World War I, he called his paintings metaphysical. He is seen as the guy who inspired the Surrealists. The Surrealists, they said, were doing things in the vein of Giorgio de Chirico. And if you look at his paintings, you can definitely see the influence. Now, de Chirico did his stuff before World War I. And do you think he was flattered that after World War I, you had this group of Marxists who were trying to do things as an homage to him? No, he hated these people. He thought they were a bunch of degenerates, and he probably wasn't wrong about that fact. But after World War I, he did the exact opposite that most of these other artists, he did the exact opposite of the things that most of these other artists' compounds were doing, whereas they were all saying, all the rules of art up until now, we need to get rid of them. They're all garbage. We need to do something different. He writes an essay called Return to Craft, which is the complete opposite of that. It's him saying, look, I am a successful modern avant-garde artist. I've made it. I have come up with a new style of painting, and I have made it in Paris's upper class. And I'm saying, like, it's done. It's completely played out. Where has this gotten us? It's gotten us to a place where nobody has basic technical skills anymore. Nobody can draw. I am saying, I'm giving you guys permission to say we need to come up with serious academies again, where we get the apprentice to do nothing but draw plaster casts for 5 years before they can even touch a paintbrush. The group that he was mostly ripping on with this was the Futurists. Now, I guess it's the Futurists. They were the ones who helped Mussolini and the fascists come to power after World War I. But again, the Futurists, they did most of the stuff that we associate with futurism, the motion paintings in the early 1910s. And it's funny reading what he was writing about the Futurists. He said these people are have had no talent. He said some people say that maybe we needed them to look at art in a new way to bring us into the 20th century. He said we need these people as much as we needed World War I. We didn't. And it's actually quite funny at the end of this essay. I was pulling it up right now. He really leans into them. He says they have a lack of profundity, no sense of humanity, absence of construction, hermaphrodite feelings, homosexual plasticity, fake historical interpretation, and false lyricism. So I just want to say something. False lyricism, homosexual plasticity. 100 years ago, people were saying this is fake and gay.
Yeah, there you go. Send me the link of that, Ben,
sure.
And I'll attach it when I post it. Like, we don't have to do it right now, but just send that link to me for that essay, because then I'll attach it, because I'll put a couple of the Chirico paintings up too, so people can see. I'll post at least one image anyways. And so it's a good reminder. And this is, again, like the very point that you're saying is that the art world and the intellectual world is very, very good at not seeing what it doesn't want to see.
Yep.
Right? And because there was a whole aspect of surrealism that, like, it went both ways with the surrealists. There was like the Marxist surrealists, but there was also the fascist surrealists. And there was this, like, I think there was a fascist surrealist manifesto as well, too, if I remember correctly.
Sort of. The fascist surrealist kind of never got off the ground in the first place. I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole right now, but Andre Breton, who was the leader of the surrealists, he was a complete acolyte of Leon Trotsky and of Sigmund Freud. And, they say that the surrealists, nobody could figure out what they believed in except that they worshipped Freud and Trotsky. Like I said, Dali was famous enough that they couldn't do anything. They couldn't touch him when he got a little too friendly with the German fascists. But he'd already made a name for himself, and he was already making enemies within the surrealist movement. So I don't think that's completely true. Breton basically kept a lid on the surrealists from about 1924 onwards. But again, I don't really think that's a valuable rabbit hole to go down right now.
No, it isn't. But if people are interested, the artists are like Ponce de Leon and Caballero, as well as Dali. And but it is interesting that, there's still a debate like today, is surrealist Marxist or fascist, right? And that's kind of, there's still sort of an indecision that way. But you're right. It's one of these few places in modern art where there is a kind of question. Otherwise, the vast majority of it, unless you really go looking for it. And as you say, it's probably mostly early. But most art is really dealing with, left-wing, progressive revolutionary themes. And there are books, there's the novels and there's story. And so there are aspects that do push back against this. But again, and this is one of the things that we've been doing on whatever this thing is that we call the dissident right, is uncovering and reading these authors again. With the first time that you grab somebody like, say, Ernst Jünger, and you realize, like, oh, you can critique fascism from the right. And you're like, well, that's a novel idea. Mm-hmm. Let's maybe dig into that a little bit.
Yes, but also, again, because the 20s in Paris was actually a real time and place with real creative energy, you could probably also find some left-wing manifestos from the time which you genuinely would say have a point, especially the ones about what really is art in this new world
Sure.
where everything is industrialized. And I'm not
just in the same way that Marx, like that you should read Marx, because there are things that Marx says, and if certain analyses that he does, that if you just reject them out of hand, you won't properly understand things.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying that the fact that something had a genuine point in 1922, you can't just say this is still a genuine point in 2025. I know we want to universalize everything, but just some ideas really are specific to a time and place. And you might be surprisingly sympathetic towards some of these ideas when you read some of these essays. I was, but just realize we do not live in there's no way we're ever going to know what it felt like in some of these cities in the immediate aftermath or immediately prior to World War I. It's a time and place that we can at best make an approximation of, and that's all. But I'm just saying that even if this is where we're stuck, if this is the time and place that we're trying to simulate, do a simulacrum of, I'm saying you can go back to the source and still find primary documents that talk about how they don't like the way things are going, and you would probably, and I think some of them still seem fresh as a daisy today. So you asked, where are things going to go in 2025? Well, people were asking that question in 1925. And if some of their ideas in 1925 still resonate with us, maybe that's where the solution is.
Or not. But
or not. I said maybe.
Maybe they never found the answer to a question. And this is why we're stuck where we're at, is because they couldn't actually find the answer to the question that they're looking for. Or maybe they didn't want the answer that's, I think, maybe suspected more, is that the answer was there, but they didn't really want to hear it. And I think we're still, and in that regard, we're still probably in the same place today, that the answer is there. And like you and I, in many ways, share this, is that in the West, it's, we have a 2,000-year history with Christianity. And the answer does not lie in modern industrial capitalism and ideology, but the answer lies probably back in the faith. And not that you're going back, but the answer lies in the faith that everybody somewhat abandoned in order to build industrial capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that there is such a thing as an objective standard of beauty out there. Now, of course, that opens up another question. If there is
the
such
1700s wants its philosophy back then.
Well, but also I'm saying, even if there is such thing as beauty out there, that almost opens the door. Does that mean AI is going to be able to find it before the rest of us do? And if that happens, is it really art? I don't know, but I keep harping on about this. I just think that by the time you reached Andy Warhol putting up flyers saying whatever product you're trying to sell, I will advertise it for you. I will put the cultural imprimatur of Andy Warhol on it. By the time you reach that, I just think that the whole concept of art was just maybe played out, and so maybe it's time to let it die. I don't know.
Which is another, then what, right? That's it. That's an interesting, and maybe we should just leave it there. Is it time to let the whole thing die? And then, very good. Anyways, Ben, thank you again for a very engaging conversation, and I really enjoy the back and forth, and it's been a fun time, because this is a topic that I enjoy talking about, and it brings me back to my late teens and early 20s. So that's one of I get kind of nostalgic about it, and it makes me want to go start painting again.
Well, like I said, I just started doing this series on my podcast. I guess it was a little more than a year ago. I put out my first episode in the series in November of 2024. It's November 2025 now. I just thought it was going to be a gimmick throwaway episode of my history podcast. I just thought it was going to be, we had beautiful paintings. Then one guy stuck a toilet into an art gallery, and then everything was reconstructed. And it's always more complicated than that. Don't get me wrong. I just didn't expect it to turn into basically the whole year of 2025 that has taken over the format of my podcast is one art history episode after another. But how
many books have you read now with this?
Not just I've got my bibliography list that's growing on my smartphone. It's several pages long. I haven't counted them, but this is the thing. I was expecting it just to be a little bit of art history, but talking about how these avant-garde artists all became propagandists. A large part of those 30 hours are talking about the political context behind everything. Because if you're talking about art between the wars, the biggest tastemakers were named Mussolini, Stalin, Hitler, and Lenin.
Yeah. There's definitely truth to that, right? I mean, have you ever read or not read, seen the documentary, The Architecture of Doom?
I have not.
You would really like this one, Ben. The Architecture of Doom. You should be able to find it. It's about 2 hours long in English. It ran, I think, on PBS, but it basically does a deep dive into the art and architecture of the Nazi regime. Okay. And they were very, very purposeful about it. Like aesthetics was a key aspect of Nazi ideology. Well, and they had a very specific vision for what art and architecture was supposed to be.
Well, you mentioned this concept of kitsch earlier. That comes out of an essay in 1939 by Clement Greenberg, and he explicitly says it in there that kitsch is what they're doing in Germany and in the Soviet Union, where they are putting rules on everything for the vulgar little guy to understand, because the little guy can see what's impressive about a Nazi building, or they're receptive to Soviet propaganda, old-fashioned style paintings about the Red Army. But art has to be something new and forward-looking that's not just that. So this whole concept of kitsch, this is why I don't like that word. This is why I don't believe in viewing things through that framing, is that whole idea of kitsch is just a negative definition that's trying to poo-poo what's going on in Nazi Germany and in Soviet Russia, saying we want to do something different than that. But that doesn't, I don't want to say anything nice about these regimes, but you know what? Maybe we should say that they at least came up with some good art between the wars.
Well, that they did. So anyways, with that note, thank you again, Ben. And I'll put links to your show, and we'll also include that De Chirico article, because I think that some people might find it fascinating, just because it's not the ordinary thing that you're used to reading about.
It's the complete opposite. Yeah, that's
why exactly. So yeah, very good. Alrighty, thank you again, and take care till next time.
Yeah, my pleasure.